Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jim, and I am alcoholic. And I want to thank Jay for the gracious invitation. Um, so I wasn't nervous all day until I turned on my computer like 25 minutes ago, and all of a sudden I got nervous. And then I look at the size of this meeting, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, I'm starting to feel a little bit of pressure. And so my wife says to me earlier today, she says, what are you going to talk about? And she said, you're like the only one. I'm like, so you don't think I can talk for 45 minutes? And she's like, well, I guess you can, so, and I'm the quiet one. So that's where that comes from. So where do you start? Experience, strength, and hope. And so I am originally from New York. The old country in my family was Brooklyn and Manhattan. Being Irish and Catholic and from Rockaway was usually self-explanatory. Getting sober in New York, everybody knew that that was a recipe for alcoholism. As a young kid, and I was thinking that I was not a particularly gifted kid. I was not one of those child prodigies. I did not make friends easily. I was content to play by myself. A lot of times, I was not a particularly good student. Wasn't a particularly good athlete. I was a pretty average kid in a lot of ways. Um, and I think that, growing up, well, a quick digression is I think part of the reason for my wife and I, the bond that we share is that we share a similar childhood pain. And, I took that into high school and it was pretty much more of the same for me. I, I went to a good high school and I was a little bit behind my freshman year. My junior year was my toughest year in high school, and those were my best grades. I was ranked fifth in my class. And that summer is really between junior and senior years when I started drinking and getting high. And I went from being in top five to the bottom six in one semester. So, and it's like a direct correlation to my drinking and getting high. So I went off to college and I went to school in Denver. And I think, I was thinking about it this week is that for me, it was I had this opportunity to reinvent myself. And for the first time in my life, I was, over a short period of time, I became one of the popular guys. I was hanging out with the cool people all the time. I had a bunch of friends, and, I was not, we used to joke the only time our education was interrupted was while we were in class. And, so we spent a lot of time, drinking and doing bong hits and listening to music. And so my first couple of years of college um, were remarkable in the sense that, it was some of the most fun I think I ever really had in my life up to that point. It was bad in the sense that they were like my worst grades of all time. I ended up after my first year being on academic probation, and then I get to so my third semester in college was my first 2.0. And then my fourth semester in college, I had a 2.5, which was a B, a C, an incomplete, and three withdrawals. And it was all in that semester. I think like my first class was at 11 a.m., and I would miss that class because, I'd be hungover or, my roommate had organic chemistry and he'd come back at 9 o'clock and start at 9:30, start kicking me in the head and, get up, do the bong. And, we'd be doing bong hits at 9:30 in the morning. And that pretty much my day was shot. So I am clearly one of those people that, once I started, you, there was no, um, I think the big red flag for me was there was a real level of unpredictability in all of my drinking and drugging. Like anything could happen. And so I get to my fifth semester in college. Well, let me back up for a second. So I joined a fraternity. Um, and that really was transformational for me. Was, a lot of the guys that I mean, I had some really good friends. And, the thing that it was good and bad for me was like nobody ever left me because they were my fraternity brothers. So no matter how drunk I got or how high I got, somebody always made sure I ended up in at least a chair someplace. And so, and I think that probably enabled me to go for long periods of time. I mean, my first semester of my sophomore year, I had blackouts, Friday and Saturday night for like 9 straight weekends. So by the end of my freshman year in college, I knew there was something wrong with my drinking because I just couldn't keep up with all these friends of mine. I'd end up in blackouts. So I remember seeing that summer, there was a commercial on TV in New York that, showed a middle-aged woman, standing at the window with a scotch. You could hear the cubes clinking in the glass, and she was looking out the window. And at the end of the commercial, it said, if you've ever thought you have a problem with alcohol, chances are you do. For more information, write Alcoholism, P.O. Box, Albany, New York. So I did, and I went and I did, and I sent me the brochure, and there were questions like, have you ever missed time from work? Well, no, because I didn't work, right? I was a student. They've since revised that brochure to because the guys like me, I'm pretty sure. Um, so yeah, there were definitely a bunch of yeses, but I wasn't ready, and I knew from that point on. So I get to I got kicked out of school, and I got academic suspension. And I went back to New York, and the semester before that, I'd been doing a bunch of drugs and drinking a lot. And that January through May was a really bad time for me. I was 21 years old, and it was probably the worst 4-month period of my whole life. Um, I probably needed a detox and a rehab at that point, but nobody knew, right? At that point. So that summer I started working and I started to come out of it a little bit. I started to run, started to exercise. I think a lot of that stuff, just my system started to clean out. And then I went to school in the fall and I got some decent grades. And so I got back into school in Denver and I went back out to school in Denver. And, that was probably my best semester in college. I got some good grades. I had a car. I mean, I drank, but I didn't really, I wasn't out of control like I had been. Um, so now I'm home for a year. And so now I'm going back to Denver. And, like this time, it's going to be different. I know it's going to be different because like I had worked and I was going to school and I was getting grades. I was studying. I was a little bit more serious. And I was confident that it was going to be different. So I was driving out to Denver with an old roommate of mine. And so we ended up getting stuck in Omaha. And I had to fly from Omaha to Denver. So we running out to the airport. My flight's delayed. So we did what we always did. We went and got something to eat and started drinking. So of course we start doing shots of Jack Daniels, and then the famous last words, right? The last thing I remember, is the door of this bar opening and the bright sunshine hitting me in the face. So the next thing I know, I'm walking around the airport. And so I'm looking at the monitors for my flight. I have my ticket. I'm looking for my flight and I can't find my flight. So I finally walk up to a ticket counter and I say to the guy at the ticket counter, I says, can you tell me where the flight to Denver is? And he looks at me and says, excuse me? And I said, can you tell me where the flight to Denver is? And he says, let me see your ticket. So I show him my ticket and he looks at it and hands it back to me and says, you're in Denver. So I was just like, thank you. And I turn around and walk away. Like, oh, I knew that, right? So, here it is, right? This is like, it's going to be different, right? This is the story of the alcoholic, right? This time it's going to be different. And I arrive in Denver in a blackout. Uh, So that semester actually was not a bad semester as far as, you know, all that other. So then I get to the summer of, I guess it's the summer of 1981, and I get a DUI. And I'm going to school, going to summer school, and I get a DUI. And um, so I get a DUI, I get home, and I go to school, and I hadn't met the terms of my academic probation, so I got suspended again. And then I get home and I hadn't paid my rent because I'd been drinking and doing drugs, using my rent money. And the landlord's like, you got to be out by Friday. So in 24, less than 24 hours, I got arrested for drunk driving, got kicked out of school, kicked out of my house, and my car impounded. And all I could think was like, wow, that's a really bad day. And, in hindsight, it's like it's all a direct result of my alcohol and drug use. It was all a direct result. So I go home that summer and, I'm still living with mom and dad. And like my dad at that point was was so pissed at me that he couldn't even look at me. And when he would, like, he would get these veins that would pop out over the side of his shirt, and like my sisters and I would be like, so how many veins was it? We still joke around about that. So that November, that October, Yankees were in the playoffs. I was going up to a Yankee game, and I was with a buddy of mine from college, and I'm like, the whole way up to Yankee Stadium, I'm saying to myself, I'm not drinking, I'm not drinking, I'm not drinking, I'm not drinking. I'm going up in the escalator. I'm not drinking, I'm not drinking, I'm not drinking. I had a beer in my hand before I was in my seat. And it was gone before the end of the first inning. And here we were off to the races again. And then so that night ended up, I ended up at so I go to this is in October, so I was coming home that night and I put the car up on the sidewalk and I hit one of these like big concrete giant like tree pots that was on the sidewalk. And it's rolling around on the sidewalk and people like so I did what any good alcoholic would do. I drove away, right? So I got away with that, but I did a bunch of damage to the car I was in. And then it was like a couple of weeks later, I went to my first AA meeting. And I went on Thursday night. It was an open meeting. A guy comes up to me after the meeting. He's like, "Is this your first meeting?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah. How did you know?" And it's not obvious it's your first AA meeting, right? And I was by far and away, the youngest person in my home group. I was 23 years old, and it was the old like they gave me a book and told me to keep coming back, and that was on a Thursday night. That Saturday night, I went out with another buddy of mine from college, and ended up in Flanagan's on First Avenue drinking scotches at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then drove home that night. And again, that was the beginning of November, and I got the window rolled down, and I'm freaked out. I'm going to have another blackout, or um, so I make it home and I wake up the next morning, and that's when I had my first real epiphany. The epiphany was, it was that moment of clarity, I think that some of us are blessed with. And it was that, how bad does it have to get before I do something? Like what has to happen, before, because I knew I had to stop. And that was it for me. It was that night I went to an AA meeting and I've been without a drink since. Um, so I got involved right away. It was right away. It was within a couple of weeks of that first meeting. They had a business meeting, and I was going home. And they're like, "Where you going?" I said, "I'm going home." He said, "No, no, no, no. We got a business meeting." So in the kitchen we go, and then it's first thing of the day is I nominate Jimmy to make the coffee. Any objections? No. Boom. All right, Jimmy, you're making coffee. I was like, I don't know. We'll teach you how to make coffee. And then, after that, I was the chairman. I would open the meeting. We had a Sunday and a Thursday, so I would open the meetings and introduce the speakers. And then after that, I did a midnight meeting for a year and a half where I did everything but the money. Coffee, sweep the floors, all that stuff. So my first year in the program, my first the first couple of months, I smoked some weed a couple of times and I did some coke a couple of times. But, it was the story for me was that if you told me I had to start counting over, because I got high, then I was going to drink too. And, I really hung on to the only requirement is a desire to stop drinking, and I clearly had that. So I end up, being sober for, I'd celebrated, I guess it was my third AA anniversary, my birthday, my sober birthday, and I was really unhappy. I was miserable. And I walked in, I had been on a Matt Talbot retreat. And so I'll come back to that. And I really wanted to drink. I walked into a bar 3 times on that day and I was ready to drink, but I was looking for somebody to buy me a drink. Uh, so I run into this guy, and he was the younger brother of a guy I used to drink with. And we were talking for a minute, and he says to me, all he talked about was, getting high and drinking and partying. And in that moment, I saw myself. That's exactly what I was like after my first semester in college. And now it's like 9:30, quarter to 10 on a Friday night, and I got my midnight meeting. I says, well, I don't know if I can go 24 hours, but I know I can go two. And then, so I went to that meeting that night, and the next morning I woke up and I was thinking about this Matt Talbot retreat I had been on. And there was a guy out there who had been sober 7 years and he relapsed. And he said that the day that he drank, he sat in his Con Ed truck and he just wasn't worth keeping sober. And that really resonated with me. And I was like, now it's like, what do I need to do to be worth keeping sober? And that was it was one of the first big shifts for me in sobriety. At that point, it was no longer about what do I need to avoid so I don't feel bad. It became, what do I need to do so that I feel good? And it really was a big contextual shift for me, and it really changed how um, how I approach sobriety. I mean, for me, I had a thirst, for sobriety as much as I did for drinking. I really my first several years in AA, I was looking for, the answer. I mean, I did the S training, I did Life Spring, I was in therapy, I had steps, I had sponsors, I went to meetings, and um, I struggled mightily my first couple of years in the program. But the thing I did right was I went to a ton of meetings. I'm a believer that, you can't go to too many meetings. And I went to, 2 and 3 a day. I'd go at lunch and then at night there were usually 1 or 2 meetings at night. And I did that every day. So, eventually, so now we fast forward a couple of years, and I wouldn't necessarily describe myself, as a happy person. And I don't think people necessarily would. I used to call my wife Pink Cloud Peggy. And I'm pretty sure nobody's ever going to, say Pink Cloud Jimmy. That was just not, that was not how people would describe me. And I don't remember being, necessarily happy in those days, but I look back on those days with a certain degree of fondness. I had a lot of friends. I was really involved. We went to lots of AA dances in those days in New York, and always in coffee shops. I mean, where I got sober in parking lots and on street corners. Smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. Uh, I can remember shit in the wintertime, like standing on the street corner shivering. I was so cold. Um, so, so now, I was sober, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years at that point, and I was living in New York, and I was going to work one day, and I'm standing on the subway platform, and I have, it's like I tell this all the time. I remember what I was wearing, all those years ago, and I got tears, streaming down my face, and I was thinking to myself that, if I'm going to jump in front of a train, I'm on the wrong tracks. I need to be on the express tracks because, and at the other end of the platform, because that train's coming in fast. That one will kill me. If I jump in front of the local may not kill me, but it'll just really screw up my clothes. And meanwhile, like tears streaming down my face. And a couple of weeks later, it was Good Friday. I was going out to Rockaway to, see my mom. And again, tears streaming down my face. And, for me at that point, it was like all the work that I had done. It's like pain and sobriety for me is not necessarily from me not working the program. I think a lot of the pain that I experienced was from the work that I was doing. I mean, I had a sponsor at one point say to me, one morning, do you pray? And I said, no. He said, why? And I said, because I don't feel sincere. And he said to me, well, who said that you had to feel sincere? And I paused and I looked at him. I said, you mean to tell me that I can pray and I don't have to mean it? And he said, absolutely. And he says, not only that, that it's not quality, it's quantity. And I said, all right, I can do that. So I started doing that, and I would pray in the morning. Sometimes I would walk to work and I would be praying the whole way and I'd lose my place and I'd have to start over. And, I don't think you see a result after a week, but do that every day for 3 months and you'll see some results, and I can't tell you what those results will be, but I know the results for me were, it was that all of my, early days in this program, a lot of the acting out that I did and a lot of the rechanneling of my defects of character and my ism, the way I like to think of it, my ism is compulsivity. And, what it really was all about for me was avoiding, feeling shame. And, I finally gotten to that place where when I was on that subway platform, I was feeling shame. And a lot of it for me, it's not to, I know this always seems so weird to say, but I'll say it anyway. It was almost as if I could feel the stain of original sin on my soul, is how it lived for me. Um, but so then, but look, I'm still living a functional life at this point. I had actually gotten a job and I finished school, and I had girlfriends and I had, even though I wasn't necessarily, a happy person, I still was living, like, I don't think, like, just because you're not happy doesn't mean you get to drink, right? Just because you're not happy doesn't mean you get to get high, right? It's like, so what? You're not happy. Like, keep moving forward and keep doing the work. And I think the happiness is a byproduct, it's like, you have to work through a lot of that stuff. So, the long story, I ended up, having a bunch of different girlfriends. And at one point, and I had one girlfriend, when that relationship ended, it really put me into a tailspin. I think it was like I really felt some really significant pain. And, so as I started to come out of that, Peggy and I had been friends, like we had become friends. And with Nancy, and, Nancy started dating Pete the cop. So, Peggy and I were just together. And then our relationship went from being friends to being good friends to eventually starting dating. And so we started dating and then, eventually, we moved in together and, we were clearly on that path. I mean, that first weekend we went away, I can remember thinking to myself, it was like, and she felt it too. It's like, this is what it must feel like to be married. So, I mean, I knew at that point what I wanted. Uh, so we were living together on Second Avenue, New York, and not far from Elaine's. And so we would have homeless people standing outside of Elaine's, begging for money all the time. And every night I would take the garbage out and go smoke a cigarette before I went to bed. And this one particular night I walk out and I got shot in the eye with a pellet gun by some kid from living across the street. So So, and it's not funny. I'm not laughing at that. What I'm laughing at is, so now I got like my hand over my eye. So now I hit the doorbell a couple of times. Peggy hits the buzzer. I hit it again. And I'm like, Peggy, you need to call 911. And she's like, oh my God. She comes down. She starts freaking out. And then it's like, you need to calm down. I need my ID. You need to call Kevin. So now she goes back up, and now I'm standing there on the street. I'm bleeding. I got my hand over my eye, and I'm still like the cigarette in my mouth, puffing away in my cigarette. And I just had this like big vision of myself. It's like, you're such an alkie. It's like, here you are, like you're still smoking away, right? It's like throw the cigarette away. So I end up in the hospital, and the second night that I was in the hospital. I came out of surgery and I had woken up from all of that, and the hospital was really quiet. And I had one of those, poles with the IV bag on it. And I got up and I was walking around, and I got back into bed. And I had another moment of real clarity for me. It was that voice that speaks to us where the truth lives, I think, at least for me. And it said to me, be still and know that I am God. And, it was one of those, like I knew in that moment that I would be okay. I didn't know if my eye was going to be okay, but I knew that I was going to be okay. And so I won't go into that whole story. I ended up losing my eye. And, there was a whole big process involved in that. Peggy and I eventually decided that we were going to move to Louisiana. And so I had come down in March, for a bunch of interviews. I had like 11 interviews in 5 days, and my goal was to find a place to live and get a job in a week. So I could do all my interviews, and I drive around looking different parts of town. I get off the plane, Peg, get home. Peggy's like, how'd it go? I said, it went great. She said, "Did you get a job?" I said, no. "Did you find a place to live?" She said, no. I said, "What do you mean it went great?" She says, "It's all going to work out." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It's all going to work out." "How do you know?" "I don't know how I know. I just know it's going to work out." And so we left New York on Saturday, May 2nd. And within 2 weeks of us leaving New York and moving to Louisiana, moving to New Orleans, we both had jobs. We had bought a new car, found an apartment, scheduled a date for a wedding, and gotten a priest to marry us. And did I say that? Put the down payment on the reception place. So it was, another one of those moments of, the universe. It's like you see these life lessons, right? Of the universe moving, with providence moving to support you. And I think that, it really led me to come to, a better understanding. I think getting shot for me, was really some miracle grow in my spiritual development. Um, so we lived in New Orleans, and I had a good job at one point. I had a decent job anyway. And, I really started that I felt like, Linus with the big cloud around me all the time, and, peanuts. And I felt that cloud finally started to lift. And, I really started to feel some ease to some of that. Peggy and I lived in, New Orleans for 7 years, and then we moved to California. And, California, I had a convertible, and I had a good job, and driving down PCH, smoking a cigar, listening to the Rolling Stones, zinc on my nose. It was like, who's got it better than me? I love LA, and I really felt a lot lighter. And I felt like a lot of this um, was my reward for the work that I had done. Um, and at one point, I didn't really go to as many meetings in LA. They started to fall by the wayside for me for a little bit. And a part of it was, I felt like I wasn't getting what I wanted out of meetings. There was a little bit too much of, roll credits in LA. Like you go to a meeting in LA, and it's at the end of the meeting, it's like, roll credits, and, we're thanking everybody, and it's like, for doing service. And, it's not the way I was raised in AA. It's like you do service, and the whole point is not to get the thanks, not to get the pat on the back. How you learn humility is by doing something nice for somebody and not getting caught, right? That's the way it was beat into me. So, um, this brings us right along. So, for that, I had a good solid 20-year period of time where I felt like, you know, that, I was never going back to my early days in the program. As long as I didn't drink or do drugs, I was never going back to those days. And then my parents died. And, my parents died 11 days apart. And, they were both sick. And that, um, I was relieved that they didn't suffer, that the suffering was over. But what I was not ready for, um, was, the bone crushing sadness that I felt. I just really wasn't ready for that. And, um, my wife would say to me, well, you don't talk about it. What am I going to say? Talking at that point didn't necessarily make me feel any better. Um, and it took me a long time to really, um, I've looked back on it and maybe I could have done stuff differently. But, there was a part of me that I just had learned at that point in sobriety that, they're only feelings. You just feel your feelings, right? You feel your feelings and you live your life and you go on and it lasts as long as it lasts. That, I think, a lot of my addiction and my early days in the program was about not feeling my feelings. So and you just learn to, suck it up and keep it to yourself, right? So my wife's mother got sick and we decided to move um, to Baton Rouge. Now, Baton Rouge was never on my wish list of places to live. So I've been coming here for 32 years now, and I'm still a carpetbagger. I'm still an outsider. I'm still a Yankee. So Jay says, from Louisiana. It's like, I'm from New York. I live in Louisiana. I'll always be from New York. And it seems like the older I get and the more I'm here, the more that keeps coming back to me. It's so when we got back here, we started going to this one meeting, every week. And after my wife's mom died and we would continue going to this meeting, like I don't know how it works, I don't know why, going to the same meeting week in and week out makes a difference, but it does. And there's some way in there, it's all of a sudden, it's like you look back and you say, geez, I don't remember like feeling that way for a while now. I don't remember why and when I stopped feeling that. But, all of a sudden it's like, that sadness period of my life is over now. And, when people talk about happy, joyous, and free, that's not my experience. I don't know that I would ever necessarily consider myself happy, joyous, and free, but I live a life that is free from angst. I don't have that I don't even know how to describe it anymore. Um, I'm not so a lot of the promises have come true for me. It's like, and I don't know how to describe it. I think you have to find your own way in recovery. You need to find the sponsor who you're going to talk to. I think it's really, really important that you have at least one person in your life that you can be brutally honest with. Um, at one point I was going to therapy and my therapist was a woman. And I said to her that I'm having a really hard time being here. And she said, why? I said, because of my language or my brain, the 7 words you can't say on TV, that George Carlin always said, right? And I said, I feel like I have to, interpret or translate my thinking into acceptable language because you're a woman and it's slowing me down. And she said, well, I'll tell you this, you're not going to say anything I haven't already heard. And if that's the way your brain works, that's the way your brain works. So I think, you have to be able to find that one person, who you can be brutally honest with and who's not going to judge you and is going to take you for who you are. It's also, I think, really, really, really important to just like, especially in the beginning, go to a lot of meetings. I think my foundation of so many meetings early on really carried me a long, long way. And I think the other thing that really helped me a great deal was my willingness to be, um, brutally honest. I was one of those newcomers that people would say to me, "How you doing, kid?" And I would tell them how I was doing. And, they would look at me, and give me a pat on the back and say, that keep coming back, kid, and walk away from me. And I'd be like, if you don't want to, if you don't care, why'd you ask? But, um, I was always willing to, talk about where I was at. And for the most part, I'm still willing to do that. I, so, so life today, is not necessarily, free from defects, and it's not necessarily free from, um, issues. I don't want to say troubles. I don't necessarily feel troubled, and I don't feel like I have necessarily big issues. My wife and I have a fairly normal relationship. We have spats now. We don't battle. And I don't know if anybody ever saw the movie The Deer Hunter. When we were newlyweds, we used to have, like airstrikes coming in and, napalming villages, and it was taking no prisoners. Now we have little firefights, and now we finish them with sticking our tongue out at each other, and that's the mature way that we handle problem solving. But it works for us. Um, I think so. So I still have, so some of the stuff, I don't know if it's ever really going to go away for me. I still have these moments of um, social anxiety, for lack of a better way to describe it. I still have, but the thing is that I don't live in my stuff anymore. I don't think being sober and working a program is being free from, like I'm not one of those guys that's I don't know how to describe it, but I think it's not necessarily about freedom from whatever it is. I think it's just not living in it, whatever that it is for you. I mean, for me, it's not living in my fear. It's like, do I have fear at times? Yeah, sure I do. But I don't live in it. Do I have anger sometimes? Yeah, sure do. But now I have filters and now I have buffers. Do I say everything that I want to say to my wife? Absolutely not. Have I learned to take a moment when when anxious or doubtful? Absolutely, I have. I mean, look, I'm not going to read the book with you. You want to know what's in the book, read the book. You want to talk about what's in the book, we can talk about it. But, I'm not going to hold your hand, and the way in AA back in the day for me was, you want to drink, go drink, we're not going to talk you out of it, but you want to stay sober, I'll spend time with you. Um, and I still feel that way. I think that, AA is a program, it's not for people that need it, it's for people that want it. And I really strongly believe that. I think that um, you really have to be willing. Uh, I think, that what happens to this in this program, you see a lot of times that people that end up, it becomes very real for people, and it became real for me. And I think that you see it's around that 7-year window. is where it starts to become very, very real. And real in the sense that you start to feel things. It's like your first 4 or 5 years in the program, for me anyway, it was just about staying sober. It's like, yeah, you stay sober, don't hurt yourself, don't hurt anybody else. And then, it's that 5 to 10 years is when you really start to do a lot of the heavy lifting, is when you really start to see, is when you really start to get through some of those layers of the onion and you really start to learn about yourself. And at least that's the way it was for me. And, I see people that they can get 7 years of sobriety, they can't get eight, and they get to that point where they just, I think, it, you know, feeling pain in AA for me is not necessarily, once again, I know I said it earlier, it's not because I didn't do the work, it's because of the work, and I think you have to unwrap, it's like you have to undo, you have to unwrite the code that you got installed into us by, our teachers, our parents, our friends, our whole life experience. I don't think you can walk away from um, your life experience. At least for me, I take that with me wherever I go. I mean, I'm not 6 years old anymore. I'm not 7 years old anymore, and yet there are times I still feel like an 8 year old. And it's like I have to remind myself, that when people don't call me back and I get my feelings hurt, that it's not necessarily about me. I still have that. Um, sometimes that's hard. Sometimes that's hard, but I think it's also, um, about living a day at a time. And what are you doing up here? My wife's annoying me right now. So that's one of my big defects of character is so the New Yorker in me. So I am not easily offended, but I am easily annoyed, so. So, it's like, please. So like, so look, it's one of those things. Like when you bite your tongue, nobody knows that you bite your tongue. When you don't bite your tongue, everybody knows.
Jimmy,
It's that. Thank you.
5 minutes.
Thank you. So it's that restraint of pen and tongue sometimes. There really is that whole, taking a moment, right? Take a moment, breathe through it, and there are times it's like, I look, I'm not perfect at it. There are times I snap and bark um, but hopefully I can. So I had something not long ago with one of my brother-in-laws, and so I was out with him one night, and him and his wife, and me and my wife, and we were, I said over dinner, I said, guys like you are the reason I'm in AA today, and he, I don't know if he heard me, and it's like because he's the type of guy who can go out to dinner and have a cocktail before dinner, and then maybe have a second cocktail, and then have a glass of wine with dinner, and then have um, and then have an after dinner drink. And, I was never that guy. I was never the guy who could drink. Um, I just was never that guy. So, um, I'm sorry, I just got distracted. So 3 minutes, right? 3, 4 minutes to go. So, you know, all I have to, I think I always feel this responsibility when, that I need to say something deep and profound, and I'm not always necessarily deep or profound. Uh, but I do, I look at all these speaking opportunities as practice for speaking at the Bill Wilson dinner in New York. It goes back to being a newcomer. That was my goal in life was to speak at the Bill Wilson dinner. Um, I don't know that I'll ever get that invitation now that I'm here in Louisiana. Um, But I do, I mean, look, this like you don't drink no matter what happens. You don't get high no matter what happens. You go to meetings, you have people in your life who you can talk to. and you walk through life, I was not going to make it, uh, as a person who was, as a young person drinking, I was in, like in the no wake zone, heading for the rocks at full speed. I was just not going to make it. So now, as a result of my involvement in AA, I got to have a life. AA was not a bridge back to life for me. It was a bridge to life. I got to have a life. I got to experience good times and bad times. I got the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. I got to know success and failure. I got to feel my feelings, and here I am at a point in my life now where I'm not I'm not so immersed in. I don't feel what's the what, that whole pride in life thing. I don't feel um, this whole like I'm not what I do. I'm not what I have. I feel good about that. I don't necessarily feel like I have to prove myself anymore. Um, and I'm not necessarily looking to keep up with the Joneses anymore. I think one of my goals in life would be able to get all my stuff in my car. I mean, I don't think that'll ever happen, but um, so I got to be a husband, I got to be a brother to my sisters, I got to be an uncle and nieces and nephews, I got to be a son to my parents. I got to be there for them at the end. And so looking forward to we've got another wedding coming up in the fall, and we're going to be taking a big trip up to the Northeast, and we're going to be going seeing a bunch of family and friends. And I get to be there because I'm sober human being today. So don't drink or drug no matter what. Go to meetings, get a sponsor, and I think that's all I got to say. I hope I left you with something, some gratitude. I hope. Thank you. Thank you, Jay.